So thank you all. That's a really interesting picture, isn't it? So there's quite a few of you who are trying it, but we've also got some people who feel quite successful on that end, and even some experts in the room. But don't be shy if you're an absolute beginner or are still sort of setting your first steps on the journey of self-management, because like I said, I think we're all still learning. So do keep your questions coming. Right, I'm going to end the poll here.
We don't see the results. Oh.
Now we can, yeah.
Sorry about that. I was obviously not aware that you couldn't see this. So yeah, like I said, so we've quite a few people who are trying it at the moment. That's the biggest score, and a bit on either end. A nice normal distribution, I would almost say. Okay, we have still a few people coming in, so welcome to you slightly latecomers. If you can put in very briefly something about your background, your role, your location and your organization in the chat, that'd be great. Any questions you might have for Lena, please also put those in the chat box and I will try to distill them for the question and answer slot later on. There will be plenty of time for that. And I'm now going to hand over to Lena, I think. Over to you.
Yep. Thanks, Paul, and good evening, everyone. Really nice to virtually meet you. I'm sharing my screen. Just can I have a quick thumbs up? Can you see it? Does that work? Yes, fantastic. Great. Yeah, as Paul said, it's quite a grandiose title, and I will definitely not be able to answer all of the questions, but I will try my best to just share a little bit of my experiences in what it means to try and transform a quite hierarchical organization into one that adopts principles of self-management. A very quick introduction to myself. My background is actually in strategy management consultant, and I've spent most of my career working in and around government and the third sector, particularly here in the UK, where I did a lot of work with health and social care organizations and local government before joining the Centre for Public Impact, which I'll be talking about more today, in 2017. I am a very fresh new freelancer. I left my role at CPI at the end of December, and I'm really currently on a little bit on a finding out journey, whether I am enjoying this or where I'm heading with this career right now. I do want to say, like, I'm not an expert at all. I'm really here to learn, and I'm also not here to promote any specific model or approach, but I just really enjoy the dialogue and the collective learning. I do also want to say that I'm no longer speaking on behalf of the Centre for Public Impact. Like, there's nothing in here that no one in CPI has not heard from me before, but it's really my own personal views based on my experiences of leading this transformation at CPI over the last 3.5 years, and they don't necessarily represent the views of the organization. So it's a little disclaimer. So what am I going to talk about? When Paul asked me to, I was like, oof, how do I best structure this? I feel there's like so much to share and so much that we learned along the way. And I tried to structure it under like 3 buckets. So I'll briefly talk about each of these questions. So the why, which basically seeks to answer what were the drivers that prompted this transition, and what have we learned about the drivers that we had. The second question is the how, so how did we end up going about it? And the third question is who was leading this entire thing, and what would I do differently in the future? And I think I'll need probably around 20 minutes max to talk this through. So we will have like plenty of time for an interactive discussion afterwards. So yeah, put your questions in the chat for now, and then I'll try and get back to them at the end. So starting with the why, and before I go into loads of detail, I'll give you a quick overview of what the Centre for Public Impact is, because I think that is quite unique to our story. So the Center for Public Impact is a not-for-profit. We, I still say we, you can tell I only left recently. It's an organization of roughly 50 people split into 4 different teams, where it's a global not-for-profit. So we have a team in the US, a team here in the UK that's called the Europe team. Then we have a small team in Australia and New Zealand and a team in India. And then the Global Hub team, which is also based here in the UK, and which runs basically operations, communications, etc. And I should say that there's a close link between the Global Hub and the Europe team. And I was part of that team, which is that we used to be just like one central team based over here. And that is also the team that adopted self-management as a practice. In terms of what we do, CPI is, as I said, is a non-profit, and we seek to work alongside government, alongside other third sector organizations who seek to bring about or make a difference in people's lives by really adopting approaches that focus on the relationship between government and citizens, and who adopt more of a learning approach in their work. So I'm not here to like just make advertising for CPI, but it's a really fascinating organization, so you should go check them out. I can only recommend that. But instead, what I'm here to do is talk a little bit more about the journey that we went on as a team and what we learned from that. So the CPI self-management journey started in October 2018, and I'm just trying to give you a little bit of context because I think that's quite helpful. So we were a UK-based team of 15 people. We had a program team, comms team. Among these 15, we had 5 layers of hierarchy. Looking back, that always seems like quite mind-boggling to me, but if you think about it, it's not that crazy. We had like an executive director, directors, managers, senior associates, but still for 15 people, 5 seems quite a lot. We had 2 sets of organizational values, some that were internal, you can see them on the side, even if it's quite small. And then we had external values around, you know, speaking truth to power and being impartial, etc. And we had many other features that you could argue were a little bit inherited from the Boston Consulting Group, which is a large international strategy consulting firm, and which founded CPI in 2015. And these features include things like annual performance appraisals, bonus payments, we had monthly anonymous pulse check surveys. And I think it was to some extent really natural that CPI had these because, as I said, we were founded by BCG. We had among the founding directors, they were largely former BCG consultants. So it just felt natural that this was there, but it wasn't really helping us. And so in 2018, we decided we had to change things. And we asked the team about 2 years into the journey, why do you think we made this switch? Why do you think we transformed? And what we heard back was a mixture of, yeah, sort of like was in reaction to the fact that things weren't quite so good and that hierarchy was somewhat hindering us. But there was also quite a strong argument that it is part of like, we need a test of what we're talking about because part of CPI's work in research and our belief is that we need to share, power needs to be shared more, and it is part of the change that we want to see in government. And so it felt like part of our walking the talk. So I think trying to summarize the why, I would argue the why for us was that there were like some deep structural issues that, you know, something wasn't quite right about our setup. There was also this like itch that, you know, could this go better? There must be a different way. But I would say probably at least as strong was this like intellectual curiosity, this desire to like try something different, largely inspired by the authors that I'm sure you will have come across at some point, and various other resources and organizations, Birdsong or well-being teams who we had heard about and thought, oh, this is very exciting. And so we had this like diffuse feeling that I feel is coming out quite strongly with many of the organizations in the third sector I talk to, that it's like, this is like the right thing to do, isn't it? So that was like very much at the heart of why we decided to do this. And reflecting on it, I think there are two things that really stick out. And one is that this like itch to do something differently was much stronger felt by some in our organization than others. And I would say I was definitely part of them. I felt, oh, we had to do something differently. But I think we failed, and I very much take responsibility for that as well, like to really listen to how did others who might have been in less senior positions, how did they feel about this? What were their needs? And I think we didn't quite pay enough attention to that and weren't explicit enough about it in our drivers. And I think the second thing that I noticed when looking back at this is that I think we somehow got the order wrong between the how we work and our purpose. And I tried to like articulate it here, but I think we learned a lesson around purpose and values in slightly the opposite way than I would probably do it now. We adopted self-management a little bit like as an end in itself. So we didn't quite ask ourselves what model of working would best help us achieve our purpose, but we were like, oh, there's this new thing that is kind of really cool and exciting, and I'm sure it's going to help us with some of our tensions. And and then secondly, we didn't, and I touched upon this very briefly, we had these two different sets of values, and they were just like words on a PowerPoint slide. And I think we didn't quite make the connection explicitly enough. So instead of having the purpose inform your values and how we work, I think our journey evolved slightly the different way, which is something I think we would probably do differently nowadays, and something I'd love to hear people's views and experiences on. Second chapter, the how. So how did we go about it? I said it started in October 2018, and it was that Adrian, the exec director, made the decision, you know, we were going to become self-managed. And I was laughing a little bit because I saw this blog from Buffer like last month or something. The blog is actually from 2015, and I really wish I had read it in 2018, because what they described there is pretty much exactly what we did. And what they also mentioned is that this is not such a good way to do it. In a nutshell, Buffer did, and so did CPI. We decided pretty much overnight to remove everything that was part of our former structure. So we got rid of line managers, we stopped one-to-ones, we had managers like stepping onto day-to-day roles, and we also said people can choose freely of what they work on. And while this, you know, created a lot of freedom and excitement among some of us, we also realized probably 3 to 4 months in that people felt anxious. There was definitely a lot of uncertainty, ambiguity. There was not a lot of trust among us. Nobody had a good view of what was going on. And so we realized probably 3 to 4 months in, this was not the right way to go. And we got some help in, and we worked very closely with Helen Sanderson, who is, I mentioned earlier, she's the founder of Wellbeing Teams. We also worked with Andy Brogan from Easier Inc. and with Lisa Gill from Tough Leadership, who gave us training on coaching and feedback conversations. We brought these people in a little bit on an ad hoc basis, but they ultimately helped us to develop some of what I tried to summarize here in under these four headers. We started to make things more explicit by capturing what we're doing and how we're doing it. I think, like probably many other small organizations, we were previously we didn't have much written down ever on how we were going about things, and a lot of things were just assumed. So we started to really make things explicit and created a playbook. We also defined a set of cornerstones, which basically were like a descriptor of like the fundamental basics of like how we wanted to work with each other. And to give you one example, like one of the cornerstones was we challenge and support. So we don't have line managers, but we instead really support and challenge each other through like peer-to-peer mechanisms. And I'm happy to share like further examples for that, but Andy Bogan's confirmation practices, for example, are a key element of that. The third thing we did was we developed team agreements, so that those are instead of kind of empty values that we had on a wall previously, these team agreements were trying to describe behaviors of how we wanted to show up and be with each other. And the last thing we did was to really make a more conscious effort of getting to know each other. So we created one-page profiles and work history films and spent a lot more time just to know who we were and what our personal goals were, development goals, which I think was really incredibly helpful. So that's a little bit of like the actual like what we did. But I do also want to cover like, you know, what did this look like? Who did it? Who took it on? Because obviously developing this new way of working, and given that many of you indicated in the chat that you're kind of right in the middle of it, you know that it takes a lot of time. And the way we tried to make sure that this is seen and is part of our work is we embedded it into our normal way of organizing work, which is we use a method called objectives and key results. I'm sure many of you have heard about, but you set annual objectives, and then in our case we on a quarterly basis set key results. So we added to our framework an objective around wanting to become a source of inspiration of how to run a purposeful organization. And then I copied here from our documents the key results that we had at the beginning of 2019. And you can tell that we are wrong, which reflects the way the journey, like which reflects our journey. So we said in Q1, when we were still really naive, we could just like, you know, let's develop a feedback approach and everything's going to be okay. We then had a little bit of a crisis moment and realized, nah, it's not going to work. So then we had a key result that was really around creating the scaffolding. And out of this key result came a lot of the things that I talked about like a minute ago, like the playbook, like team agreements, etc., etc. I said I would cover the who, and I think there's one critical thing in this, which is that we, as part of our cornerstones, is that we were able to self-assign to key results, and so we had we also self-assigned to taking on ownership for developing our model of self-management, and slightly in hindsight, unsurprisingly, but the people who were leading it over time was particularly one of my colleagues, Danny Berkeley, who left, and myself. And we did it because we were intellectually curious. We thought this was fun, but we also did it because we felt like we had a responsibility to like continue doing it. And I think we didn't quite acknowledge also how similar Danny and I were in terms of characters, like the way we like to work. And so I think it's fair to say that a big lesson for us is that we should have been much more conscious of trying to have a more diverse group really work on this and push this forward. I think that's been one of the biggest challenges for us, particularly later on as we had changes in the team. So there are two other reflections on the entire question of like who can drive this. One thing is around senior buy-in and particularly their leadership. So Adrian is a huge supporter of self-management, remains until this day, which is great. But I think in hindsight, I think it needs greater leadership from the most senior people, including board, in order to really help the transformation. I also think external help and support is absolutely invaluable. And I think continuous support is probably better than the approach of kind of trying to find different people to help you at different moments in time. And it just takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of time and a lot of energy. And that is why I think thinking about this, I still wonder how organizations can people who are leading this work, because they are ultimately subject to a lot of, it's hard, it's really tough. And I've definitely lost many nights of sleep over this, but I also have really enjoyed it. So it's quite tricky. Then I do think there's a huge thing around how to ensure that we listen to those who often don't get heard, and also bearing in mind potential future hires, because I think at some point, I think we've turned it around, but I feel we were at some point heading in the direction of designing a CPI that would feel very comfortable just for a certain type of people. And I think we've been able to turn this around, but that is definitely something I think we need to pay more attention to. And recruitment and onboarding is also something that I still grapple with quite a lot, because I don't think the traditional practices necessarily lend themselves that well to self-managed teams. But yeah, I'd love to hear the views and experiences of the people on this call on some of these questions. So I've spoken already for quite a while, and I'm really curious to get into questions. But in trying to summarize what I just said, I think in terms of the why, I think my biggest takeaway and lesson has been to be really clear about the drivers and start by exploring the things that are inhibiting, that are kind of not getting done because of the current structure. And I think just intellectual curiosity is not enough, even if it's fun. In terms of the how, I think asking for help and really being prepared to invest a lot of time, potentially money, but then really collectively develop a model that works. And in terms of the who, I think, as I said, senior leadership needs to play an active role and needs to lead this by working with a diverse team. I think those were my key lessons, but I'd love to hear from others. I might stop sharing my screen so I can see the chat better. There we go.
Yeah, so thank you, Lena. It was a fascinating story, and I'm sure there will be many questions. If you want to ask a question, if you could just raise your virtual hand. That's probably the most civilized way of doing it. Don't be shy. Who has a question for Lena? Eduardo.
Hi, Lena. Thanks for sharing. What is evidence for you that the shift has really happened?
So evidence in terms of, I can tell you a lot, give you a lot of evidence in terms of just the formal structures. I think we know you will not go into CPI and find a lot of lived formal hierarchy. So there are no things that would be equivalent to line manager check-ins or performance appraisals, any of that sort of, to some extent, reasonably traditional top-down management you won't find. I think more importantly is what you see in terms of how people bring their ideas in. I think particularly in the last year when I was heading up our Europe team, I think what we were able to achieve in that team is that people, no matter of their point in the hierarchy, which always there is always going to be people of different levels of work experience, etc. But I think what was really powerful is that even someone who was, in terms of years of experience, the most junior, she was really driving one of our work streams to the extent that it has become a key pillar of our strategy. And she did that because she had a lot of freedom to just, bring people together and bring her own ideas and make them flourish. And I think that is part of where I would say, oh, this is really exciting. There are a lot of other things around, how we spend money, how we make decisions, where we've adopted a lot of the approaches from this. We do a lot of consent decision making, so it's something safe to try. But I think, probably the biggest shift is more just in the way people of, no matter no matter basically of like what level they're hired at. Yeah, the contributions that they make to the overall aim.
Thank you. Brian, you've got a question.
Yeah. So Lena, thank you for this presentation. I really appreciate seeing how another organization has done it, and kind of the retrospective dimension of it. I'm curious though. In your lessons learned, you explicitly called out that that senior leadership basically needs to be on board, and that suggests that in your experience they weren't on board. So I'd like to hear kind of what was some of the friction. What did you see as ways that what was senior leadership's leading objections as you were implementing self-management, and how do you try to overcome them, either with or without success? Yeah. So we can kind of learn how to cultivate that buy-in from leadership roles.
Yeah. Oh, great question, Brian. So I really want to clarify that, like, CPI's executive director Adrian, who is still he's still the executive director. He is fully on board. He really believes in the principles and the concepts. I think one of the big questions for me, looking back at CPI, and that is, I'd love to hear from people from large organizations. I think one of the reasons why this is and feels particularly hard at CPI is that we didn't roll it out across all of the organization. So I mentioned earlier that we have teams in different parts of the world. The North America team, which by now is even larger than the team over here, back then it wasn't, they always were a little bit more on the fence and said, why don't you guys go figure this out first, and then we'll see if we want to join. And now we have a situation where we have two very different cultures in this organization, which is, even if it's global, it's still not a big organization. And I think this goes back to the purpose, values, how we work question. But I think one of the challenges I observe at CPI is that it still feels like we're doing self-management because some of us really believe, and I used to be one of them, that it helps us be better at what we do. But there's not a collective buy-in into that from across the organization. And given that we're all working towards the same purpose, I think that is what's causing this friction. And that is, I think, when I say you need, it's like senior buy-in, I think you need this connection to purpose. And I think that needs to be set at the very top, is my impression. And it's, I think, one of the lessons I feel I learned, but I'd love to hear from people on this call who, you know, may disagree or may have seen something completely different.
Well, let me offer that perspective then. So back in 2016, when I was an engineer at Google, my team of 75 people, we implemented holacracy. And so that was my introduction to team self-management, and I was so inspired by that I became the in-house expert, and you know, went to all the practitioner and coaching trainings, and it didn't last very long because Google is a very fluid organization, and there was a reorganization. We had new directors, and so our ratifying authority was reassigned to another team. And so the new director said, we don't want to do this anymore because, you know, for a variety of reasons. But what you know, after I got over my 2 weeks of acute depression, because I was all excited about it, I did what we do at Google when we have a failure. We do a post-mortem analysis. And so I reached out to all my teammates and said, well, what was working? What wasn't? And if another team at Google would try and implement holacracy or any other form of team self-management, what would you recommend? Or what was working for you and what wasn't? And so I got a lot of feedback, and I kind of was rather surprised that so many of my teammates were of the mind I don't want to manage myself. I want to come to work, be told what to do. I do it. I collect my paycheck. I go home, done. So their relationship to their work was very different from my relationship to my work, because I saw it as I'm fulfilling my sense of purpose. I'm trying to empower people with the internet, and that resonated very, very much with what Google was trying to accomplish. And so that's it's just a job perspective I found disappointing. And then I realized that different people are gonna be coming to the work with different sets of values and different personal objectives. As long as they're not, malicious, that's fine. We will all find a way to work together. But it kind of opened my eyes that whatever self-management system gets implemented has to be able to accommodate people who are they're at different places on Maslow's hierarchy of motivation. So it needs to be able to accommodate people who are just there to collect a paycheck versus people who are saying, no, this is part of my self-actualization. And then I also realized, because that the way we'd hired Holacracy One to help us implement it, and their standard process is to go through an immersion process where you just everybody starts doing it all at once, and there wasn't any time to warm up and cultivate a sense of ownership of the process. And in hindsight, with that, once I learned not just how holacracy works, but why it works, and then collected all that information as to why it didn't work, I was able to see, oh, we didn't have to implement it that way. We could have taken a more modular approach. It would have taken us longer, but we would able. It was an opportunity to cultivate more participation in the process with the whole team. And we were a global team also. We had offices. We had a team in Tokyo, Sydney, Zurich, Dublin, and in California and Washington. And there's more now.
If I may interrupt, then can I ask a question following on from that to the group, as much as to Lena and yourself, Brian? Is it perhaps better to start bottom up? Is it perhaps better to start with the front line, with the teams, to find out what really would change and improve their lives, rather than bringing in some sort of new way of working with the assumption that will improve everybody's lives and everybody will love it? Stunned silence.
Well, I'm letting others talk. I think you were asking the whole group, not just me.
That's right. Lena, what do you think in hindsight? Because you also highlighted in your talk that some of your team was perhaps not as bought in as you had assumed.
I don't think it's either. I don't think it's either. It's one or the other. To be honest, I don't think it's a bottom up or a top down. I think the most important bit is to answer the question, like what is currently not working? Like, what are the current structures? Like, how are they like getting in the way of us collectively working towards our shared purpose? And you need to hear the answer from everyone, like definitely from everyone. And I think a part of the issue that we face is like we didn't quite confront that question in as much clarity. And I think, Brian, based on your first comment, I also think people will have very, very different views and perspectives on this, exactly because of what work ultimately means to them and how important it is. But I think it really comes back to this question of like, what is really getting in the way? Like what is the issue that we need to solve, rather than this view of like, let's do this because it is like the right thing to do. Sorry, Dino, I see you have your hand up for a while.
Yeah, sorry. I was going to ask a question around, it's obviously doing away with, line managers, and this is something that's obviously quite relevant with the pandemic. What did you do, or how did you kind of safeguard employee well-being? Because, more and more, managers are really key, especially in the kind of remote environment with everything that's happened, ensuring obviously, the well-being of people for someone they can talk to and get support from. So how did you approach that?
So I think before I give you the like processy answer, I think 2020 really put our model to the test in the sense that it was only like about a year old, and we had major staff changes at the beginning of 2020. Like nearly half of the team went to maternity leave with a lot of replacement coming, etc., etc. And I don't think we did a great job. And I'm pretty sure most of my colleagues would agree. But what we had, or what we also then put back in place in 2021 is we have basically, instead of line management, we do 3 different things. One is a person within or outside the organization who is basically your career advisor, who's the person who will have your back, make your case, lobby for you, stand up for you, advise you. And that within CPI can be someone from any team, but that is the person you should give regular check-ins with in terms of how you progress. We then hold check-ins in relation to the role that you hold, and this is more like I think closest to a performance check-in, but it's based on our assumption of challenge and support. So we use a coaching approach where on a bi-weekly basis you're paired up with someone. It's pretty random, and you run through your respective roles and just share what you're doing, and then you coach each other that way. And in the third component that we do in relation to this was initially feedback, but I have to say even during 2021, the feedback conversations, when I had them, they very often didn't turn into feedback conversations, but much more of how are you actually doing, which then I think it was because of the circumstances, I think we should have probably reacted properly and put something else in place, but I don't think we made the right call there. But in theory, we replaced line management with these 3 elements.
Okay. Do you think that those, because obviously trust is one of the kind of key things in order for, you have to build trust, whether you are coaching someone or mentoring someone. If it was things at random, do you think you had that? Or, I mean, I guess you had that, you were a small company on your side?
I think we were small enough to do that. Certainly, I think particularly with new joiners who, I mean, some people I met for the first time after 12 months, it's it's really, really hard. I mean, we also tried a lot of social things online, but it is, you're completely right. It's really been incredibly hard.
Cool, thank you.
There's been some interesting questions on the chat. I'm going to start here with one that always evokes a bit of interest, if not emotion, about salaries. Tracy, was it your question? No, Mala. Do you want to ask a question yourself, or do you want me to read it out?
I can ask it. I mean, it's there. It was just around salaries and how if there was any changes to salaries that that reflected the transition that you made. And I'm thinking particularly around parity of pay, and whether there was a situation where it came like this or people went like this. And obviously I'm not asking you to disclose your own personal information, but just more how you navigated that, if there were any changes at all.
So it's a great question, and it is an area where I wish we had done more, but given that it is an area that creates such anxiety among people. I'm also sort of happy that we didn't do it given the timing of our transition. So I'd love to hear from others who are like more experienced in the space, but the only things we did at CPI is we introduced complete salary transparency and had thereby like much more open conversations around, you know, who gets paid what, which was uncomfortable, but I think that's good. We did not, and I don't know if CPI will ever do it, have conversations that are more thinking about, you know, where do people sit? I will also have conversations around, you know, to what extent if I take on different roles, responsibilities, like where, you know, how should this be reflected? We never got to that point, but I think it's such a tricky question. I'd love to hear from people who did that. I always look at what Buffer has been doing in experimental state. They're also quite radically transparent about their salaries, but yeah, CPI was not, didn't go much further than just making the salaries transparent.
Yeah, it'd be so interesting.
Sorry, Marla, go on.
No, I was just going to say it would be so interesting to hear, because these are discussions that we keep having, but we're like sort of new, and you've like made some really helpful points about how to get there. But I guess it's just that question of hierarchy and the reality of a non-hierarchical structure, though I agree it's impossible to run something without some level of hierarchy, but still hierarchical pay. And it's just a question. So yeah, if anyone can enlighten me, that would be really great.
Well, it's a question that comes up a lot indeed when you talk about, especially when you talk about removing the managerial function and divvying up some of the managerial roles, splitting them up over the various team members. Then indeed the common question is, okay, so now that I take on managerial roles, will I also get paid for that? And I think it's a valid question, and I think if an organization has thought this through, the right answer is probably why not? And you certainly have seen that in some of the self-managing organizations, that they have deliberately pitched their salary level slightly higher. Now that may be yet another hurdle for an organization that's considering self-management to think, oh, can I afford this, especially if it's not going to succeed? But ultimately, that's one of the things that you do need to bear in mind. The second aspect around the transparency of salaries, let alone the self-setting of salaries, which of course is yet another leap further, is a topic that has been raised, I think, by Charles Towers Clark, who did a talk for us last year, and for them in the Pod Group, an organization that he was the CEO of at the time and brought self-management to. It was a very interesting journey for them to get to that point where salaries were becoming transparent. And I think the point that you made, Lena, about how trust, the importance of trust in the organization was underestimated almost as a success factor for the process. It really came to the fore in the Pod Group when they got stuck on the discussions around transparency of salaries, because that really brought out that actually deep down inside, trust was a massive issue still in the organization. And to me, for me, reading about it and hearing Charles's story was really therefore that establishing and working on and assessing the levels of trust in the organization is one of your first steps in the whole process if you wanted to succeed. I think that's really important. Is there anybody out there in this group that have also worked with or towards salary transparency or even further than
that? Kamala, for all my experience with salaries, I think there is no a set of rules about how self-management would deal with salaries. For me, the biggest shift is people starting to be able to change agreements around how salary is defined and distributed. So I think once I can adapt the agreements around salary, how it's evaluated and how it's decided, then I think we start to go towards self-management in this topic. But for me, there's also two things: that how are the variables connected to decide the salary? So do you go with time of experience? What do you value to decide the salary? And also, how do you decide around this from a centralized decision maker, from a committee, from the level that you self decide your own salary? So for me, it's this joinment of variables and decision making process that people can always adapt when they feel they need to do to process an intention they have.
Thank you. Yeah, so it's really interesting that you've made some steps in that direction that most organizations fail to get to, if I'm totally honest. Richard, you have a question, and then there is a question that Charles asked that we can address after Richard's.
It's not so much a question as I suppose an observation or a bit of shared experience, in that as I put in the chat, as you can probably gather, I'm not in my first flush of youth, and in 1979 I was a co-founder of a tech collective. We actually called ourselves a computer co-op at the time, but it was founded around, and what was interesting was the parallels in Lena's experience with our experience, in that it was primarily driven by a desire to set up a collective. It was the idea of working non-hierarchically that sort of brought us together. And I mean, I think it is an interesting story that I won't tell here, but I mean, it went through a variety of, I mean, some very painful times. I mean, I have to say that, you know, at its worst, it was the most miserable working experience that I've had in my entire career. I mean, I saw a comment on Twitter somewhere about one of the problems with self-managing teams is they're not very good at regulating abusive behavior. You know, there was a sort of fairly extended period when that was going on, but we came through that, and we then had a really good period. I mean, it's just various thoughts, but I mean, what was interesting was the fact that what drove us in the first place was just this idea of we wanted to work differently, and we also wanted to do something. You know, we were all working in computer software in one way or another, but you know, our actual ideas of how to work together and what we were going, and even worse, you know, what business we were actually going to do. You know, we didn't agree, we just did it, and then found that we had massive disagreements in terms of how we should work together, and it was very painful. But you know, and I mean, I was there for 7 years, and you know, and it's probably some of the best, some of the worst, and some of the best times. You know, you do learn an enormous amount in that time, and I think particularly about, I mean, a topic that I'm interested in now is sort of how to do change when you have no power. You know, how to, and it stood me in good stead in my consultancy work, because as a consultant, if you're working with organisations, you have no power, and how to actually. And I think this issue around trust. I mean, when you know, Frederick Laloux's, I haven't actually read the full book, but I saw a slide which is about, you know, I trust you to make decisions on my behalf. And I thought, you know, so much of, if you are to get it to work, it is about building trusting relationships. And we had different salary models at different times. Initially, it was everybody got paid the same, and then that led to so much resentment because different people were bringing in massively different levels of income. We moved to one where it was sort of, you got paid, you got the money that you brought in, you paid a fixed amount to cover the running costs of the co-op, and then the rest of it you could either use to pay yourself or to sort of fund projects that you wanted to pursue. And then when we sort of resolved the problems, we went back to an equal pay model, which worked well for a while, but as we started to recruit people at different levels, as we started to bring in new people who had less experience, that became a source of tension as well. So I mean, my view is there's nothing new under the sun. I'll put a link into a post from Corporate Rebels that actually references back to coal mining teams in the 1950s that worked as self-organizing teams. And I did an engineering degree. As part of that, I did a course in industrial sociology, and we were studying self-organizing teams in places like Volvo. They introduced, so it's been around for, it's not a new thing, I think, but how you do it and how you make it work. I mean, it's what makes life interesting, I think. And I think it is, given that I don't like hierarchies, I don't have any good answers. But the other just final point was that I went from working in the collective to working in what was then called a software house, which these days would be a digital agency. And that was, it was a conventional hierarchy. It was very flat. And they had complete salary transparency as a policy there. And that worked really well, so long as it seemed to be fair. And I think where you have a management team that actually understand their capabilities, it was run by techies, and where you have a management team that understands who's good and who's not so good, by and large, I think it worked. It did work really well. Anyway, so a set of rambling thoughts, but I think it's been a really interesting talk, Lena, and to hear your journey, and I think quite a lot of parallels in terms of my experience many years ago. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you, Richard. Really, really interesting. I think you're absolutely right. And it's something that always fascinates me. This sometimes feels like it's the new thing or whatever. I think it's just like you mentioned, like so many people have been doing it for a very long time. And me personally, I'm like definitely a little bit late to it, but yes.
And I mean, just one other anecdote. It was when I did a vacation job.
Richard, if I may interrupt you, I quite like to make sure that I give some of our other attendees the chance to have their question heard. So if you don't mind, I'm going to move on to...
No, sorry.
That's okay. Charlie, if you're out there, do you want to ask your question yourself? You work for a small charity, I understand, and trying self-management with some trustee issues, or do you want me to?
Yeah, can do. I will try. My internet is not very good. So yeah, Lauren is also on this call. So it was just in response to the
you are breaking up a bit.
Okay,
Charlie.
does someone else want to read out my question, Lauren?
Your colleague is here. Lauren.
Hi, let me just just scroll back up. Lena, you said it needs senior buy-in and leadership. Our charity has just 2 employees, me and Charlie, working 4 days a week each. Our chair of trustees is our line manager, still unofficially, since he removed the general manager role last year. We're all happy that this was the right decision, but we both feel that we need more support than he can give us in his voluntary role with limited time, roughly a day a week, but not much working with us directly. We have a board of 10 trustees, 5 of which are new in just the last few months. All have committed to 1 day a month. Any ideas on if and how we can be successful in a self-managed model with less senior leadership than we feel we need?
Very tough question. I mean, now I think first of all, it's like amazing you got your trustees to commit 1 day a month. I know how hard it is. So well done for doing that. I think the hard thing is, and I don't know, I don't quite know how to interpret that component of the message. To what extent is it that like you just need more support and time from them in as a in a coaching capacity? Like, what exactly are your needs, and or to what extent do you need them to be more supportive of of a new way of working, and or their help to actually articulate it?
I suppose more of the first, but a little bit of the second. Most of them are very much on board with moving to self-management. We've just set up some working groups within the trustees, which Charlie and I are in basically more or less all of them, and then the trustees are in one or two each. And they're just starting up, and only a couple have been some rambling, but some of them have only literally just started. Some of them have been going for a few months, and we're having a bit of struggles with the sort of working principles. You mentioned like team arrangements. I think it's the same thing as working principles. We're having a little bit of an issue with one trustee in particular with working differently in that way.
I think what I can do afterwards, I'm very happy to share with you a bunch of like resources, documents, things that I found really helpful, that largely come also or have been published by Helen Jansen and her team on Open Teams, which is a great resource anyway, which I think can help with some of these conversations. I'll happily like to share some of the things afterwards, because I know that like you are not the only ones grappling with these questions, particularly in like very small organizations. But yeah, I'm happy to connect afterwards and just share a few things that might help with these conversations. Because yeah, I can completely relate that it's so hard, particularly when you have people who do this on a voluntary basis. Like, how do you really hold them to account? I think it's really tricky.
Lena, I wanted to ask you a question that I think builds on what Lauren and Charlie are perhaps also going to benefit from. You mentioned something around team agreements, and how you found that it was quite important to construct those at some point. We have found, certainly in the Buurtzorg context, when organizations have adopted some sort of Buurtzorg-derived model, that having both an internal team agreement that says something around how the team functions, but also what we often call a framework, which defines the relationship between the team and the wider organization. What's the team there to deliver? What is the organization expecting from the team? And what kind of support is the team requiring from the wider organization in order to be able to deliver that? I was really curious what, in your definition, your team agreement entailed, and why you found it so important or so beneficial, actually, for your process to move forward.
So I think I would definitely say we didn't 100% nail it. We took a lot of inspiration from Buurtzorg when thinking about these team agreements, but we felt that also because we previously had these different sets of values that were all the good things, in the world compressed on a PowerPoint slide, we felt that was not so meaningful. So the team agreements really tried to be an articulation of the core things that made all of us work together effectively. And it was the hardest thing to develop them, because when you try to find a way of capturing the essence of how we want to work together as a team, and you ask 15 team members, you end up with a list of about 40 things that really matter. And then trying to narrow it down to like a few tangible things was incredibly hard. But they included things like we stick to our commitments and renegotiate them if we can't fulfill them. So that means if I tell you, Paul, I'm going to send you something by Friday, you will get it, or I will get a phone call from you telling me off about it, or you will get a message from me on Thursday saying I'm not going to make it. But like, I think those were the things that we really tried to enshrine basically as something we do. We then tried to come up with a method that allowed us to check in on this on a regular basis, like how well are we actually living up to these team agreements, so that they wouldn't just be a slide on the wall. And again, we tried to use confirmation practices, which is a really amazing method, I think, that Easy Inc. Developed, which is more like a self-reflective practice. But yeah, I found them really helpful for us as a team. I think, again, the pandemic didn't make it easy at all, because it's much easier to just forget about it, deprioritize it. But yeah, I think that was what I thought, or why I think team agreements are helpful. They just set like a basic level of accountability of how you want to be with each other in the workplace.
And how did you deal with the wider, the interaction with the wider organization, or perhaps even, you know, top exec management?
We didn't quite have that challenge, to be honest, because I kind of want to say it doesn't, CPI just doesn't work like that, but I think because we were like just like a team within CPI, we obviously had loads of interaction with the other parts, like the North America team, the Australia New Zealand team, but I think it's easy. It was to some extent easier for CPI than it might be in other organizations, because we are more like closed entities under one umbrella, I think. So I think we didn't quite have that challenge in the same way.
Okay. Interesting. Any more questions out there? Or challenges?
I'm sure that you've already said this, but how do you make it like a group sort of, how do you encourage, because I used to work in a team, and some of them were procrastinating, and they were doing it to be selfish or to be funny. It was quite a young team. How do you get past that when you're like like I'm 25, let's say the youngest one was 21. How do you sort of encourage them to you know, do it for themselves and do better for themselves, to keep the team motivated and not try to act cool in a sense, you know, try and make sure we do the best we can, you know, making that look cool instead of procrastinating? How would you do that?
So to some extent, I wonder, is that a challenge that becomes...
It's a question for like a marketing team.
Frankly, if somebody isn't taking work seriously, they will ultimately be called out for it, regardless of what model of organization you have. Like in a hierarchy, you know, a line manager will tell them off. In a well-functioning self-managed team, this will surface through peer-to-peer challenge. And I think, reflecting on like how it worked in my team, we definitely had instances where some members of the team were not performing to the level of expectation that they should be. And I think the mechanisms that we had to encourage them and support them to be better were receiving a lot of feedback from various different people who you work with on different projects, and then having the regularity of what we call confirmation practices, but of these check-ins where you're like basically coaching each other to be better at work. But frankly, if somebody doesn't perform, they have to go. I think that's probably that is probably quite similar in regardless of what management style you use. So answer your question. Sorry, it was a bit wordy, but
Jake, did I answer?
Yeah, that answered my question. Sorry, yeah, but just a little bit more actually. You said about going to your line manager. This was the dynamic: the line manager and the manager, and maybe one or two members of the team. They were the detrimental ones. Majority of the team wanted to do well, but like we had a line manager and a manager, and then a few of the young ones who weren't doing well, what would you do? Like, so say like it was like a massive circle, and the people at one end of the circle were meeting up. They were terrible, but the rest of the circle, they were really good. They wanted to do well for the company. They wanted to try and achieve goals. How would you bypass that and sort of influence the whole circle to do well?
Really, really hard question, Jake. I struggle to respond to that, like in the abstract. I don't know, Paul, Tanya, if you have experiences from your work.
That's what I guess. Like it's quite like that in Britain, anyways. Maybe probably that's what it is.
Tanya, do you want to say something about this?
Yeah. Hi, everybody. Really difficult, Jake. You know, I feel for you. I think ultimately bad behaviour needs to be called out by somebody, and that's obviously very difficult if it's your line manager who's managing you in that context. And I think Lena's point about a team agreement, the purpose of a team agreement is to try and together decide what kind of team behaviours the team wants to abide by. So I think if you try to have a conversation perhaps with everybody about, well, what are the things that we think are really important in the way that we work together, then maybe you can start to hold each other to account according to those things that you've all agreed together as a group.
Yeah, I like that. I like that idea. Yeah.
So I think that might be a way to tackle it. I mean, I think if it gets really out of hand, you know, I think someone else coming in externally to help facilitate or work with the team obviously is one way, but that might not be an option for your organisation. But I think let's all sit down together and work out how we want to work together and what's really going to make this team, you know, meet our team goals and what we're here to do. And what does that mean, and how do we have to behave then together, and what do we want from each other? Those are some questions that maybe will help form your team agreement.
Great, thank you.
Thanks, Tanya. Dino, you have your virtual hand up.
Yeah, sorry, I just had another question. You mentioned, obviously, we talked a bit before about kind of trust, and I was wondering about, in terms of the organization, how much of a kind of, how safe did people feel, how kind of blameless was the culture? Because I work in financial services. Quite often it's expected, you know, that someone is held accountable for certain things, and there is sometimes a reluctance or a fear around making decisions. So did you have to develop much in terms of, you know, guidance for people to know that, yes, I'm okay to make this decision, or, you know, or to reassure them when they can or when they should seek others? Yeah,
really, really great question. Let me try and answer it in two parts. Like on the decision making, 100%, it took us a long time, and it's still kind of subject to ongoing review. Who decides what, and using like what sort of decision making mechanism. And we that's, for example, stuff that we document in the playbook. So it would, to give you an example, talking about money, there is a threshold. Under that threshold, you can just spend the money for, be it you need to buy books, you need to, you know, whatever it is, under that threshold, just do it, whatever. Then for each like key result team, again, there's a budget within that, you know, just go about, do it. If it's higher, then we use, you have to bring it to the team meeting, and we use a different, like, so we have like tried to like clarify like where are like the boundaries. That, however, doesn't create psychological safety, I found, but psychological safety actually like goes, I think, much deeper. And one of the most shocking experiences, frankly, to me was that, so we used consent also quite a bit, like the is it safe to try, and so basically you go around the room and you know ask, you know, any clarification questions, etc. And then ultimately, you know, do I have your consent? And I think after a year or something, somebody said to me, Lena, I would never say no in those rounds. I said, what? You know, that defeats the purpose of this whole thing. Like, you know, why wouldn't you say no? And they said to me, because everybody would think I'm crazy, you know, why would people care about my opinion? And that to me was like the most shocking moment, because again, like I felt, you know, I made the huge mistake of just assuming, you know, we have a good culture, it's all going to be fine, but clearly it wasn't. So we then had a lot of conversations about this. We also did a lot of, particularly during the time, I did a lot of reading, studying on Amy Edmondson's work, which I find really fascinating. We did a lot of like collective thinking of like, what could we do to create more of this safety? I'm not gonna lie, like I don't think we nailed it at all. I think the team still has a very, very long way to go. It's still something I need to learn a lot about, but I have found that the clarifying of the processes, you know, is maybe 20% of the job. I think the much bigger piece is just how do you really create the safety in the team?
Yeah, because obviously, as you said, trying to get people, it's one thing for people to give it anonymous kind of feedback, but obviously if you're asking in a group, because they have relationships, even as, you know, friends and things, it's like, oh, well, you know, I don't want to go against them. I know they're really up for this, but I don't really agree with it. But yeah, quite a challenge.
Yeah. I don't know if anyone's using Murmur, but I'm always intrigued. That's like Erin Dignan's like platform that basically puts consent decision making more into like a structure. And I always wonder to what extent doing that online virtually means people say more no than doing it in person in a round in a room, or even if it's a Zoom call. It's much harder to say no in person than like to add a comment to a document. I don't know if anyone has any experience with Murmur or other virtual tools for consent decision making, but I'd love to see if that makes a difference.
I mean, I run lots of things like postmortems and retrospectives, and one of the benefits of being remote and virtual is you know, whereas it used to be someone would go and walk up to a wall and put a sticky note on and people would know exactly who to put that on. You know, people can now, you know, you type it, there's no handwriting, you can do things anonymously, and there are some benefits that can come with that. But obviously then you have other challenges about making sure that everybody is participating, you know, you are, you know, giving everyone an opportunity to speak, or they're taking that opportunity.
Yeah. Tanya, I just saw your question in terms of, yes, at the answers we had a team agreement around how we wanted to deal with conflict. I frankly can't remember the exact words. I think that was a very good example of like, we put something on paper, but it's very, very different to then live it. What I personally found really helpful is I started to just admit every mistake brutally on email. Like I always sent the number of like really long emails I sent out to the team where I said, sorry guys, I did this wrong, I messed up with this. And the more I did this, the more I felt others were starting to do it. Like, but I think again, this is where, you know, it's the informal formal hierarchies really come in. Like I think you can set a good tone for it, but it's really hard to do. Yeah. So
you did that to demonstrate the kind of behavior that you wanted to instill, basically.
Yeah. I think it helped, but yeah, it was definitely uncomfortable.
Yeah.
I love Dave Snowden's work, Richard. I'll definitely look up his this ritual that you just shared. Thank you.
Right, we're coming towards the end of this session. Time has flown by. It's been a fantastic discussion. There is perhaps a minute for a final short question. If you've got one burning question that you want to put forward now, this is your chance. No. Okay, well, in that case, first and foremost, I want to thank Lena for a fascinating and very open way of sharing your story and how you perceive the journey yourself. So let us all thank Lena in the customary way. Well done.
Thank you
so much. Before you all go, I would love to hear from you what other topics, what other formats, perhaps even what speakers you would like to see in the future events that we'd love to organize. Of course, if you'd want to put yourself forward, that is also very welcome. We are always looking for interesting stories and experiences. Whether they were successful or unsuccessful, that doesn't really matter. There's always interesting learnings to come from each story. Please put them in the chat. This is your time to do that. We hope that that you had an interesting time this evening. I certainly did. The recording of this event will be on our Reinventing Work Cambridge site. If you want to know more about our group or the various activities that we organize with TrustWorks, then please contact me either through Meetup or through our website. Thank you very much all for attending today. It was great having you all here, and see you at our next event.